You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
So first things first this morning, I need to issue an apology. Last week, I checked out the podcast, and it was 47 minutes long last week. So I don't know what happened. I apologize to Tara, who's actually not here. But Tara was in Roots and Shoots, and so we went well over time. But I guess, the old saying, time flies when you're talking about awkward things like dying to yourself and being crucified with Christ. Am I right? So speaking of that, that's what we're talking about. We are in week 2 of the Late to the Game Lenten series that I'm calling Confronted by Calvary. And so if last week left you feeling a little bit uncomfortable, raise your hand. Good, some of us were listening. It should. That's okay, and you certainly weren't the only one. In fact, the subtitle I'm giving this series is a series on the cross that'll cause a smidge of discomfort. So just buckle up and expect that to happen, okay, friends? Lent, the season that we are in, I think we are in week 4 of 6, is a season that causes us to focus on the cross, right? This is a time where we contemplate the cross, and it has this way of unsettling us in sort of just the right ways, right? Not because Jesus is harsh or demanding, but because he's honest. Jesus doesn't beat around the bush when it comes to understanding what is being asked of us to follow him. It's not some, assent to a set of beliefs. It's not a bunch of religious rules that we have to follow. Jesus gets right into it and says, this is an invitation. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who we said last week, he famously said that when Christ calls a man or woman, when he calls us, he calls us to, he says, he bids him come and die. He's like, this is the invitation. Basically, you're coming to die, right? And so for some of us, that means literally to die, what Bonhoeffer calls the grace of martyrdom. But for all of us, anyone who calls themselves a follower of Jesus, it is a stark reality check that this commitment to follow Jesus will ask you to put something to death, some part of you that needs to die, to be crucified. Those parts of ourself that are in resistance to the way of Jesus, that resist the way of Jesus. And as we looked at last week, that can get kind of awkward. That can get uncomfortable when we're honest and we face that reality. And if you didn't listen to that message and you have 47 minutes of free time this week, I would encourage you to go back and give that a whirl because, I was really challenged to give it, and I heard lots of feedback from those in our community that they were like, whoa, that was really, just a tough message to receive, but a good message, I think, for all of us to be reminded of. So, again, we talked last week about the difference between... Who can remember this? This is pop quiz time, friends. I'm a teacher at heart, so I'm always wanting to do this. Who can shout it out? What were we talking about last week? The difference between conviction? No. Admirers and followers. I knew. Raise your hand if you knew that. Awesome. You guys are A students. Right, we talked about last week the difference between admirers and followers. And I've been thinking about this theme a lot more this week. We had a home group this week, and we talked about it there. And so it's caused me thinking. I think there's good news and there's bad news about this, about the journey from becoming an admirer to follower. So first, the good news. The good news is that Jesus actually says this is easy. That's good. He says that this whole thing about following him it's not hard. One of my favorite verses, I learned this as a kid, and I don't think there's like a week or 2 weeks that goes by where this verse doesn't pop into my head. It's Matthew 11, 28 through 30. I memorized it in the King James, and I think that's a good version. So this is what it says in the King James. This is Jesus. He says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, my teaching, the thing that I have to say to you, about how to live. Take that upon you, accept that, and learn of me. For listen to this, my yoke is easy, my teaching is easy, following me is easy, and my burden is light. And so in that, there's this promise of rest, but it comes with this invitation, right? It comes with this invitation to take up Jesus' yoke, his teaching. Not just to know about Jesus' teaching, but to actually intentionally go out and to live this teaching. And as we said last week, that means dying to self, or laying down our lives, or taking up our cross. These are all sort of synonymous terms that's essentially pointing to the fact that we are not perfect as we are. Parts of us need to be transformed into the likeness of Christ. Do you agree with that? Parts of us need to be changed. And so he says this teaching, Jesus says this teaching is easy. And I don't know about you, but when I think of dying to myself or being crucified with Christ, easiness is not the first term that comes to mind, right? So what does he actually mean by that? And I think this is sort of where the bad news comes in. And I say the bad news in quotations because it's not really bad news, but it definitely comes across as bad news at first. So the easiness does not come from the absence of challenge and hardship. Like we know, anyone who's tried to follow Jesus knows this is way harder than it looks. It's difficult. So the easy, he's not referring to that. But what he's saying is it's the presence of practice. That's where the ease comes in. Just the reality of the need to practice. I'd say following Jesus isn't about perfection. It's about formation. And formation takes practice. Formation takes discipline, right? Discipline is not fun. That's why it's bad, because nobody likes to be disciplined. Ask my kids. I've had 16 years of parenting, and I don't know any time where I've disciplined my kids, and they've come up to me and said, Dad, I really appreciate that discipline. Thanks. That's just not the way we operate as humans. We don't like to be disciplined. Here's a long shot, but does any NBA fans? No. They're like, oh, Heidi. Okay, Heidi, this is a conversation with you and me. That's great. I'll be honest, I did not expect you to be an NBA fan, but I am pleasantly surprised. I used to track with the NBA a lot more when I was younger. There was this viral moment before viral was a thing back in 2006. How many people remember Allen Iverson? Heidi does. All right, some of us do. And there was this interview, this media scrum that he did where I guess he had skipped a practice, a basketball practice with his team, and his coach was upset with him, and the media was kind of giving him a rough time. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah. All right, great. So he says, he just keeps repeating this. He says, we talking about practice. We talking about practice. And he just keeps saying, we talking about practice. We ain't talking about game. We ain't talking about game. And it's just like, it's so odd how often he repeats this. Do you remember this? And at one point he says this, we talking about practice, not a game that I go out there and die for and play every game like it's my last. No. We just talking about practice. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk like that. I'm getting the nod, no. Okay, so I will refuse. I will say that we'll strike that from the video. Anyway, so this interview with Iverson shows that he understood something and then he also missed something. He understood that there is a difference between practice and the game, right? The practice prepares you for the game. But more than this, it was the game where he went out there and was willing to die every night, right? Like he played as if it was his last game. There's this metaphor of dying again, right? That's the difference with practice. You save it for the game. But what he missed, I think, was the practice is what prepared you for the game. And I mean, I'm sure Iverson understood that. But in this moment, he's forgetting that practice is what gets you ready so that you can die in the game. And so to push that metaphor that Jesus calls us to, the practice is what prepares us to come and be able to die, to put to death that which needs crucifying so that we can follow Jesus closer. So this is what we're talking about this morning. We're talking about practice. Sorry, no, we are going to talk about practice. And this kind of brings me back to this quote from Kierkegaard that we looked at last week, and this is just the last part of it. He says, admirers are only all too willing to serve Christ as long as proper caution is exercised. Listen to this. Give heed, therefore, to the call of discipleship. So that line, give heed to the call of discipleship, this has kind of been ringing in my ears all week. Discipleship or practice is the answer to this question. How do we move from admiring Jesus to following Jesus? We become disciples in the way of Jesus as people who accept discipline and accept practice as the means of getting there. In Greek, this word for discipline is paideia. And it refers to the process of shaping a person or forming our character. And formation, for anyone who's tried to do this, will attest that it is uncomfortable. I remember our old pastor, Keith Jagger. He often spoke of formation. Spiritual formation was a big part of his shtick, what he brought to the table. And he would use this term edges. Right? He would and I appreciated this years later, but he would use this term edges to describe us. All of us have these sort of rough edges about our character, our person, who we are. And he would say, we need to smooth out those edges. That's what formation is learning to identify what those edges are in our lives that cause us to miss the mark of what it means to follow Jesus closely, and be willing to smooth them out. Sometimes it's just like a finger file that's needed to do that, but sometimes it's like a giant industrial-sized grinder that's needed to change us, right? And so formation is a willingness to be disciplined, to make the practice to take on the practice that is required so that we can enter into becoming the kinds of people Jesus would like us to be. Does everyone want another self-deprecating story? Oh, I see those nods. Absolutely you do. So speaking of Keith, this was about 10 years ago, and we were entertaining this idea at the time of me becoming an associate pastor with him, or an assistant pastor, associate to the pastor. And it was a brief sort of foray into this kind of thing. I was a little bit unhappy in my work, and so Keith was entertaining. We were growing as a church. There was lots of he was super busy, and this just seemed to make sense on a lot of levels. And so we said, hey, let's go out for dinner. So we went to El Tres. I remember this very clearly, and my wife was with us. And he said, Steve, I'm really I think you would be great in this role. I think there's lots to offer. You have lots to offer to this community. I think there's a lot of gifts you can bring to this. But then he said, there's also some edges that we need to work on. There's that word again, edges. And immediately my hackles went up, right? And so did my wife's, and she's kind of like Mama Bear, and she's like, I want to protect my husband. So I got right on the defensive right away. I was like, okay, like edges, like for me, like what kind of formation, character flaws are you referring to? Like maybe you should just work on your own, Keith, right? I didn't say this, I thought this. I instead nodded, because as you saw last week, that's kind of what I'm prone to do in awkward moments. But I said, later on to Ron, I'm like, we had this little banter session. Like, what's he talking about? Like, what? That's not really fair for him to say he needs to work on my edges. Like, work on your own. And so because of that sort of attitude and sort of resistance to being changed or to having my character challenged, the prospect of me becoming an associate pastor just kind of fizzled out. And I went back to work at the health unit and just carried on for the next better part of a decade, right? And the thing was, I was not at a place where I was open to receive correction or even direction or even suggestion that maybe I needed to work on stuff. I lacked maturity. And like I said, it's taken several years for me to acknowledge that those edges were real, right? Especially if I was going to become a pastor. I had edges about my pride. about submitting to authority. Like, I was just not willing to do that kind of thing. And Keith, who was this, he's my age, and he just had the wisdom of like an 80-year-old, just profound wisdom. He's what we would call a contemplative. And so with that came sort of this discerning spirit and all this. And so he saw in me things I was not even willing to see in myself at that point. And I imagine, I've never really talked to him about this, but I imagine he probably walked away thinking like, yeah, it's too bad. Too bad that we missed an opportunity to work together in those days. But I'll tell you this, had I said, sure, Keith, I'll work on those edges, and then I just kind of ignored it, and I actually entered into the pastoral world back then, it would have been disastrous. I promise you this. It would have been disastrous. Frankly, I shirked this invitation to work on my edges because, I don't know about you, you're probably the same, but I don't like confronting my own inadequacies. Do you? I don't like being honest with my own shortcomings as a person. I don't like the humility it requires of me. I don't like being corrected. I don't love the process that discipline demands of us. So why do I strive for it? Why do I say, okay, but I'm still going to do it? Because 10 years on, I've gotten to the place where I'm like, yeah, no, I had some issues, and I still have issues, but I had some issues that I need to work on, and now I'm doing the work. Self-awareness, it starts there. You get introspective, and you start asking those questions, and be like, okay, what do I need to do to change? Right? Why do we strive to do that? Well, I think for me, it's because I still believe what Jesus offers us here. This is what he says in Matthew 16:25. We looked at this passage last week too. This again, just the last part. He says, if you try to hang on to your life, you're going to lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you're going to save it. And I believe that. Do you? I believe that if I'm willing to put to death my old self, the stuff that needs smoothing out, the edges that need smoothing out, if I'm willing to do that there is this new life that emerges in me, not just for my benefit, and honestly, primarily not for my benefit, but for the benefit of the world around me. I want to become a better person so that my kids have a better dad, my wife has a better husband, my congregation has a better pastor. I want to be a better human for your sake, and I hope you do for the sake of those around you. This isn't, self-help mumbo-jumbo kind of stuff. This is about soul formation. We are part of a bigger purpose, right? And this is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It means we are willing to enter into discipline, to be discipled. Notice those two words come from the same root. To be disciplined means to be discipled, right? In the way of Jesus. And that means in every area of our character. And you can say, well, what does that look like, Steve? Well, actually, Paul, he breaks it down for us pretty smoothly. Actually, we call these the fruit of the Spirit. These are the aspects of our character that we need to work on. And I want to just list these, and I want you to read along with them and ask the Spirit of God to say, where do I need to work on these in my life? What edges of these fruits of the Spirit need smoothing? Here's what he says: love, selfless, unconditional, sacrificial care for others. Joy, deep gladness, not based on our circumstances. Peace and inner calm and wholeness, even in the chaos of life. There's a lot of chaos right now. Where's peace in your life? Patience, this form of enduring, especially with people and circumstances. I don't know if you have difficult people in your life. Patience is a fruit of the Spirit that tests that. Kindness, active compassion and consideration, goodness. This is moral integrity and generosity fall under that. Faithfulness. How loyal are you? How trustworthy are you? How committed to causes and to people are you? Gentleness. This is strength under control. Humility and care. Self-control. That one got me. The ability to say no to those desires and impulses that compel us and that pull us. So I think these are the markers of discipleship that we should be striving for. These are the markers of people who are willing to have their edges smoothed through the grinders and the files of discipline, through practicing, through submission. And I'm going to be the first to say there are certainly more than a few of these items that I still struggle with on a daily basis. I've not arrived. And I actually don't know that I will arrive, right? Because this is a journey, which is a bit of a cliche word, but this is a journey that every follower of Jesus is on. We are in pursuit of becoming like Jesus, who embodies the fruit of the Spirit perfectly. And none of us will arrive, but all of us are on that pursuit. All of us are on that journey. And if my journey is any indication of the process, here is what I've learned in this walk toward embodying, toward forming my character, and toward moving from an admirer to a follower of Jesus. Here's what I've learned, that discipline doesn't usually happen in dramatic leaps of faith. This is probably your experience too. Maybe not. Discipline doesn't usually happen in dramatic leaps of faith. Rather, it takes place over small, consistent, everyday choices. Is this your experience in life? It's not to say that big things can't happen that change who you are, that confront us suddenly, like, a barge hitting us or whatever. Yeah, that happens. But most times I have found that the path from becoming an admirer to becoming a follower, what we call being disciplined in the way of Jesus as his disciples, it typically happens in small, intentional ways every day, through every decision, over years and years and years. I think that's how it becomes easier. I think that's what Jesus meant when he said it's easy, right? It's not all at once. So how do we begin? Where do we start? And the answer is, if you're living and you're breathing and you have had interactions with other humans and relationships and struggles and joys and pains. In other words, if you are alive, then that journey has already begun. Right? Which brings me to something that I learned this past week. I'm in a weekly course right now called, what is it called? The More Christ-like Spirit. And there's actually a couple others in our church community who are joining me with that. It's with author and speaker. Her name is Tanya Harris. And in her book, The Church Who Hears God's Voice, I found this really interesting. She talks about two kinds of knowledge that the Bible talks about. Two kinds of knowledge. The first is ginoskene. And ginoskene is a Greek word, and it comes from the Greek, which makes sense because they're all about thinking, and it has to do with cerebral knowledge, right? The kind of knowledge that we get up here, we read books, we study. That's an important kind of knowledge. And then yada is the Hebrew form of knowledge. And this is experiential knowledge. This is knowledge that's based on relationships. And so for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into too much of this, but Harris suggests that the church has often elevated ginoskene, head knowledge, above yada. It actually should go the other way around. And think about it. What is happening right now in this moment is I'm transferring ginoskene to you guys. I'm transferring information to you. And so we study our Bibles, we go to Christian conferences, we listen to podcasts, we do all these Christian things where we receive head knowledge. And that is important, and that is absolutely critical, and that's crucial. It's necessary to the life of faith. But here's what she says, and I think the authors of Scripture support this as well. Transformation takes place through yada, through our experience. And that kind of knowledge, experiential knowledge, that's the stuff that sticks. That's the stuff that leads to shaping us, formation, changing us. And every one of you knows that that's true, right? Every one of you has gone through life, and if you were to look back on Whether it was a new job you took, whether it was developing a family, going back to school, whether it was loving someone, whether it was losing someone, whether it was making a mistake and having to learn the hard lesson from that mistake, right? Whatever life looks like for you, you have grown and you are the person you are today because of that. And here's the thing with yada knowledge. This is optional. And you all know people who fit this. Yada knowledge, experiential knowledge, the opportunity to learn from our life experiences doesn't have to shape us. We have to be intentional about letting it shape us, right? There are people who just don't learn the lessons of life. They don't grow up, for lack of a better term. And so we have to be intentional. We have to allow them to, because growth and moving forward, especially in the way of Jesus, is not a given. We don't experience all the yada of life, all the lived experiential relational knowledge, and suddenly find ourselves following Jesus more. That's just not how it works. We have to be intentional. I think maybe this is where gnoskein comes in, where this head knowledge comes in. Because when we learn about the person of Jesus and we study about him in the Bible and we listen to podcasts and read the Bible and all these things, it allows us to have the context, the paradigm, the framework for who it is that we want to follow. Right? So that integrates with the yada, the experiential knowledge of our life, and that leads us to discipleship, which is super convoluted. I apologize. But does that make sense? We need both. We need to learn about Jesus, and then we need to take our lives and allow that to shape us into who Jesus is. But how we allow that yada to form us is everything to do with who we want to become. And for Jesus followers, we want to become like Jesus. So we study him. We learn about him. So having Jesus as our rabbi or our teacher, the one who shows us how to have life and have life to the full, as he says, allows the experiences of life not to pass us by, but with every challenge and every hardship, with every joy, with every turn of our life, it gives us this opportunity to ask us, how will I allow this experience to shape me into becoming more like this Jesus guy? Again, we have to be intentional and be willing to take those small, sometimes imperceptible steps. This is where practice comes in. It's in those little decisions that we are intentional about every day. This is the heart of discipleship. I don't know how we got on this, but somehow the church at large thinks that it has to happen in these massive decisions that we make about life, and those are the things that shape us, and those are the things that define us. And I'm learning in my own, just reflect on your own life. That's not how it works. It happens in small decisions every single day in our interactions with people at school, in our interactions with people at work. How do we choose, or what we choose to say to them, how we respond to them, what we choose with this opportunity. Are we going to cut corners? Are we going to live this way or that way? So here's an example. Think about money. Yay, everyone loves to talk about money at church. One of the fruit of the Spirit we said was goodness, and part of that is being generous. So generosity is something that matters to people of God, to people who follow Jesus. And so this is an opportunity. Maybe God's not asking you to remortgage your house so that you can give all this money away to some charity or to the church or whatever. But maybe he's saying, and I don't know where you're at with your finances. I don't know where you're at in your spirit of generosity. But maybe he's saying, you know what? I want you to increase your givings. Just 5%. Just a couple bucks a month. And so there's this opportunity there for you to be like, okay, there's this prompting I have. This conviction. I see a need. I'm able to meet that need. And maybe it's not going to affect your lifestyle right now. Maybe you're not going to be compromised in any way. You can still carry on with that. And that's okay. Okay? But maybe the call of discipleship in your life right now looks like are you willing to just listen to that prompting and give a little bit more money? To whatever cause. And I would say the church is a good one. But that's maybe what it looks like. Or last week I talked about that awkward moment at the complex where I kind of remained silent in the face of these guys who were talking about the homeless problem in Thunder Bay and how it was all this and that. And I thought, okay, what does it look like? What is a small step for me in that context to follow Jesus more that will prepare me the next time something like that happens? And I thought, well, for me, I was riled up and I was super emotional. I wanted to just give it to him. I really wanted to. It's probably not going to be a very effective interaction. But also I reflected on it and I said, what were the reasons why I didn't say up? Yeah, I don't like those awkward moments, absolutely. But another reason was because I don't really know if I can articulate the problems I have with people who push back against, having to pay for homelessness in Thunder Bay and all this stuff. So maybe my job, my step of discipleship is just to learn more about the issues, to become more informed, right? It's a small step, but maybe that will prepare me so that next time I'm in that context where I'm engaged with someone or I'm listening to someone, I can actually say, you know what? Interesting you say that, because here's what is the reality. Here's what homelessness actually is. Here's why people are doing this, instead of such an emotional response. And it kind of doesn't matter what area of our life it is. I think if we pay attention, there's always going to be these opportunities for us to be discipled everywhere we turn. But again, if we want to be, that's up to us. Nobody's forcing us to be changed or to have our edges smooth. We can go through life without having any transformation. So it's up to us. And we recognize that it's through small steps. It's through those everyday decisions. That's how we become the kind of people who can one day say to Jesus, when he says to us, come, follow me, take up your cross. And we can say, okay, I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. Right now, if you'd ask me today about this area of my life, I probably couldn't do it. But if I'm doing these small steps over the next however many years of life, there will come a moment when he says, hey, follow me and take up your cross, be willing to die. And I can submit to that and say, okay, I can do this. That's how we move from being an admirer to a follower. It's not some magic formula. And again, I think at first glance, this maybe sounds like a self-help pep talk or a TED talk. But again, this is about spiritual formation. This is about soul formation. This is about shaping us into the people of God. What does the heart of Jesus look like? And what do his people look like? And this is where it begins. So as we close this morning, I want us to just be invited into this sort of moment of reflection and honesty. What might the Spirit be nudging you toward this morning? What is that one small step of discipleship, that one practice of following Jesus that you're able to take this week? Let's get practical about that. Not, to earn anything, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything. This is not about any of that crap. Just simply to walk more closely in the way of Jesus so that when the time comes, you're ready. When the time comes, you're ready. This isn't like Iverson in the game. Like this is we talking about practice. That's what we're talking about. But it's so that we're willing to get into the game and give it our all and play, like willing to die in the game, right? Maybe it's your finances. Like we said, this, a quiet act of generosity that realigns your heart with the heart of God. Maybe it's in your relationships with family or friends or workmates, choosing to listen to them, choosing to forgive them, choosing to speak up maybe. Maybe that's what it looks like this week. Maybe it's in your habits. Setting aside time to pray or time to unplug or time for you, whatever it might be. I know this is an area that I got to work on. Maybe it's in your own formation. Maybe you need to commit to learn something more. Maybe you need to dive into a podcast or a Bible study or a home group or something like that. It's like, you know what? I got to just stop living for me for a minute here, and I need to figure out, what does Jesus want of me? How is he forming me? And I have to be willing to enter into that and say yes to that. I don't know what that little small step looks like this week. There's going to be every single day of our lives an opportunity, like I said, to make those decisions, to follow. So whatever it is, I would love for us as a community to pray for each other. Make this a part of your prayer this week. Whenever you pray, that you would pray for the people around you. Look around you right now and just find a name and be I'm going to pray for that person. Just that they would be able to take that small step toward discipleship, toward moving from being an admirer to being a follower of Jesus. It's a challenge. Can we commit to praying for each other? That's something we can do, right? Because no one likes to have their edges smoothed. We don't. Discipline is hard. It's uncomfortable. It hurts. That's the reality. But we realize that this is the way of Jesus. This is the way to move from being an admirer to being someone who can, when Jesus calls us to come and die, we can say, amen. I can do this. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this word this morning, for your Spirit's challenge and how you prompt us in our hearts. And I also thank you for grace. We didn't talk a lot about grace this morning, but we know that we need grace. We depend on grace. We fail in our own strength and in our own way. And so we need you to carry us, Lord. Help us. Help your Spirit to speak to us in the moments of our lives where we can make decisions, whether it's in our relationships, our finances, our whatever area of life it is. I don't even know. Just impress upon us and don't let us escape from that. Give us the opportunity to say yes to that so that we are moving more along the spectrum of moving from admirers to followers, Father. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.